Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and obscure corners of Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and today I'd like to talk to you about money. When Ireland gained its independence in 1922, the institutions of the new state did not spring up overnight. Compromises had to be made, and some aspects of the old British rule had to remain in place for a while. One of the most visible was the currency. For 6 years after Ireland gained its independence, it still had to use the English notes and coins. This was a visible symbol of how limited Ireland's new status was. While Ireland was a free state, they would remain part of the British Empire until 1936. Ireland had its own coins before, up until the 18th century, but the Act of Union in 1801 had gotten rid of them. Now the fledgling government had to create money that was truly its own. Two separate bodies were set up to do this. The Currency Commission were in charge of banknotes. Notes are used for large financial transactions, so this was considered a serious economic responsibility. As such, the Currency Commission's job wasn't just to have the banknotes designed. They would continue to be in charge of all matters relating to Irish money going forward. This was needed because Ireland didn't yet have its own central national bank. Senator Joseph Brennan was put in charge of this commission. He had been the financial advisor for the team who negotiated the Anglo-Irish Treaty and was the Secretary of Finance for the government from 1923 to 1927. When he left the job in 1927 was when the Currency Commission was set up to begin its work. The first set of banknotes they created was designed by the Belfast painter Sir John Lavery. Despite his knighthood, he had been a supporter of Irish independence. In fact, during the negotiation of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, Brennan and the other Irish delegates had stayed at his house in London. The Currency Commission told him that the notes should have no political figures on them, and that the central figure should be an archetypal Irish girl. Lavery decided to use a portrait of his wife Hazel as the starting point. He gave her a traditional Irish woolen shawl covering her shoulders and head, and posed her leaning on a harp in front of a lake with a mountain rising behind it. The painting was named Lady Lavery as Kathleen na Houlihan, tying it back into Irish Republican traditions. In the years of British occupation, Kathleen na Houlihan was a woman who would appear in plays and songs representing Ireland herself. The artist was delighted by a comment from W.T. Cosgrove, the Taoiseach at the time, that every Irishman would carry a picture of Lady Lavery next to his heart. The portrait would go on to be used as the watermark on all subsequent Irish notes. The watermark on these first notes was the head of the goddess Hibernia, another personification of Ireland, named for the Roman name for the island. This particular Hibernia was based on a statue by John Hogan, possibly the greatest sculptor in Irish history. The back of the notes also had pictures taken from sculpture. In this case, it was the different heads carved into the Custom House in Dublin. These were river gods created by Edward Smith, another contender for greatest Irish sculptor. Each of them represented a different river around the country. The other body set up to create the new money was a committee to design the coins of the new Irish state. Since coins aren't used for financial transactions but are an important part of everyone's day-to-day lives, this committee was a lot more artistic in nature. It was headed by W.B. Yeats, the famous poet and writer. At the time, he was also a senator, where he is best known for unsuccessfully fighting to keep divorce legal in Ireland. Other members of the committee included the art historians Thomas Bodkin and Lucius O'Callaghan. O'Callaghan was the director of the National Gallery of Ireland up until 1927, and Bodkin became the director of the National Gallery of Ireland in 1927. Another member was Dermot O'Brien, president of the Royal Hibernian Academy, Ireland's national association of artists. The last committee member was the Cork's silversmith Barry Egan. Joseph Brennan actually attended the first meeting of the committee, in his role as secretary to the Department of Finance. He gave them 3 conditions from the government to take into account. The first was that the symbol of the new Irish state was the harp, and this should be on one side of each of the coins. This was actually the result of a hard-fought battle by the Irish government. Most countries in the empire were compelled by London to put the king's profile on their coins. The second was that the only language to be used on the coins was Irish, though they could include numerals as well. The third was that no modern person should be included in the design. This was probably because the wounds of the Irish Civil War were so fresh in people's minds. Yeats had his own criteria in mind, and he said in a statement about the committee that the coins must pitch and spin to please the gambler and pack into rolls to please the banker. The committee eventually decided that animals were the best option for the theme. They came up with 8 animals that they felt fitted each denomination of coin they needed. These coins followed the pre-decimal standard of English money. 12 pence made a shilling, 20 shillings made a pound. The most valuable coin, the half-crown, was worth 2.5 shillings. 8 of them would have made £1. 4 of them made 10 shillings, which was the lowest denomination of banknote. This coin was assigned the animal that the committee thought was Ireland's most famous, a racehorse. The next coin was the florin, worth 2 shillings. This was to have a salmon because of their role both in Irish fishing and in Irish legends. The shilling coin was to have a bull, and the committee mentioned that Greek designs would be good to reference. The 6 pence was given the Irish wolfhound. The committee were a little bit dubious about this one, since modern Irish wolfhounds aren't actually Irish. They were bred in Gloucestershire, as an attempt to recreate the extinct Irish variety of dogs. But it was an animal people associated with Ireland, and they did want to get a dog on the coins. The threepenny coin had a hare, both as a symbol of Irish wildlife and as a pair with the dog on the sixpence. At the time, hunting hares with dogs was commonplace. This notion of pairing coins held true on the penny and halfpenny. The penny was to have a hen and the halfpenny a pig, 2 farmyard animals. The committee knew that having a pig in the coins could cause trouble. Using pigs to represent Ireland and Irish affairs was a common tactic of satirical cartoons in the racist humour of English magazines like Punch. And they were right. They did get some criticism for it. On the other hand, they felt that leaving such an important agricultural animal out would not be true to the spirit of the coins, and that they shouldn't be that worried about public opinions. The last coin was the farthing, worth 1/4 penny. The animal for this coin was the woodcock, a long-billed game bird that was a prime target for hunting in Ireland at the time. Now that they'd made these decisions, they needed to find someone to create the new coins. They didn't want to have a competition open to the general public. This had been done to design the new Irish stamps, but Yeats thought it had put serious artists off competing. They decided that the competition would be invitation only, and that they would invite 7 people. At least 3 of those would have to be Irish. The first they chose was Oliver Shepherd, creator of the statue The Dying Cuchulainn. This statue was moved to the GPO in 1935 to commemorate the upcoming 20th anniversary of the Easter Rising. It became a potent symbol of the event, enough that it was used as the basis for a special 10-shilling coin in 1966 to commemorate the 50th anniversary. The other Dubliner was Albert Power, whose statues still adorn cities all over Ireland, from Eyre Square in Galway to St Stephen's Green in Dublin. The third Irish artist was Jerome Connor, who was born in Kerry but had spent most of his career living in America. Many of his statues are in Washington, D.C., the most famous being a tribute to the nuns who served as nurses during the American Civil War. He had moved back to Ireland in 1925, the year before the committee started looking for artists. The 4 foreign artists were a little harder to get hold of. One of the people they invited was the American sculptor James Earl Fraser. A decade earlier, he had created one of America's most fondly remembered coins, a nickel with a buffalo on one side and a Native American on the other. It was a beautiful coin, though it had to be retired for technical reasons. Fraser seemed like a perfect fit, but he had more than enough work in the US and declined. The Croatian sculptor Ivan Mestrovic was invited, but he didn't get the invitation until the deadline had passed. He still submitted a design for the harp side of the coins, which included a woman playing it, and donated the design to the Irish state. In 1965, it was adopted as the seal of the Central Bank of Ireland. The 4 entrants who were actually chosen were the American sculptor Paul Manship, the Swede Carl Milles, the Italian Publio Morbiducci, and the Englishman Percy Metcalfe. Of these, Metcalfe was the youngest and least experienced. He was the most talented at creating coins, though, as evidenced by how he would go on to design coins for England, India, Egypt, and Iraq, among others. His talent was on full display in 1927. The committee had a blind vote. They went through the submitted designs coin by coin, not knowing the artist who created each design, and voted for one from each category. At the end, they were astonished to find that every single time they had chosen a design by Percy Metcalfe. Clearly, they had found their winner. In 1928, an updated set of Metcalfe's designs were unveiled to the public. The reaction was mixed. Maud Gonne, Yeats' old muse, wrote that the coins were designed by an Englishman, minted in England, representative of English values, paid for by the Irish people. This was hardly fair, especially since Ireland didn't actually have the ability to mint the coins themselves yet. One priest wrote in the Irish Independent that the pagan symbols on the coins would beget a land of devil worshippers where evil may reign supreme. On the other hand, most of the public were just grateful to have something visibly distinct from the English coins. Over time, the people of Ireland, especially its children, would grow very fond of their animal coins. This new money was pegged directly to the pound sterling, rather than having its own exchange rate. This remained the case even after 1936, when the Taoiseach Eamon de Valera managed to get Ireland out of the British Commonwealth. He did this by making it his price for endorsing the abdication of King Edward VIII. The following year, he led the creation of a new constitution for Ireland. It stopped being the Irish Free State and became the Republic of Ireland. This meant a lot of changes, but the money didn't change too much. Any references to the Irish Free State or Sears dat Éireann turned into Ireland and Éire, and the harp design on the coins was tweaked a little. A bigger impact came in 1942, when Ireland finally got its own central bank. This meant updated wording on the notes. The coins were also updated to replace the pure nickel in the threepence and sixpence coins with an alloy. They also removed the silver from the shillings and florins. Up until then, they were 75% silver. Half-crowns continued to be part silver until 1950. Around the same time as silver disappeared from the coins, unofficial banknotes also disappeared from Ireland. It was common in the 1920s for banks to issue their own notes, a practice that still goes on in Northern Ireland. When the Irish government took over the currency, it asked the banks to stop printing sterling notes. Instead, it provided a separate form of banknotes for them to use. These were government-endorsed but not legal tender, and allowed the banks to continue to print their own notes for a time. Each of these notes had a different Irish landscape for each bank on the one side, and a picture of a man operating a horse-drawn plough on the other. Because of this, they were called the Ploughman series. When the central bank took the reins, it stopped them being printed, and they were all officially recalled in 1953. Throughout all of this, the value of the punt remained tied to the pound. This meant that when Britain decided to switch to the decimal system towards the end of the 1960s, Ireland had no choice but to follow suit. The first two coins switched to decimal were the shilling and the florin. These turned into 5p and 10p coins and kept the bull and salmon designs. In 1970, they introduced a 50p piece. This used an adapted version of the woodcock design from the old farthing. Farthings had been retired in 1962 due to inflation. For the new copper coins, which would actually be made from bronze, they decided to create totally new designs. They didn't hold a competition, but the artist Gabrielle Hayes decided to submit her designs anyway. Normally a sculptor on a much larger scale, she had spent the time convalescing from a broken collarbone designing medals and coins. Her iconic designs kept the theme of animals, but added something new. They were based on the style of medieval illustrated manuscripts like the Book of Kells, which were themselves based on classic Celtic iconography. This was most evident in the design for the new 2p piece, which features a long-beaked, long-necked bird. The way the bird is curled up is perfectly evocative of the Celtic knotwork style. The elegant curve of the long-tailed bird on the penny brings to mind a stylized letter C. The halfpenny, which was retired in 1987, had another long-necked bird spiralled in on itself. This type of imagery would become very popular over the following decades. The year after decimalisation, Ireland decided to redesign its banknotes. This time, they decided they would hold a competition to decide who would do the work, with the theme being the history of Ireland. The winner of the contest was a company called Cervicon. The team who created the winning designs were an interesting group, since they included only two conventional professional artists. Patrick Hickey was a painter and a printmaker. He had studied the craft of making prints in Italy, since there was nowhere to study it in Ireland at the time. He remedied this himself by co-founding the Graphic Studio in Ireland in 1960, where the craft of commercial design became a discipline of Irish art. That was what he brought to the banknote team. A less conventional artist was Michael Biggs. He was a sculptor, specialising in the carving of stone letters. He was the one who designed the font used on the notes, a distinctive, chunky one based on medieval manuscript lettering. The team also included two very different architects. Brian Hogan was a commercial architect who pioneered the use of concrete in Dublin's buildings. He's best remembered for designing Beaumont Hospital, as well as the Mater private hospital in the city centre. On the other hand, Richard Hurley became infamous for creating some of Ireland's most unique and inventive churches. His designs won him praise and condemnation in equal measures, but helped to set the fashion that would continue for modern churches in Ireland. It was an eclectic group who came together, something reflected in the notes they created. The first of the new notes released was the £5 note in February 1979. A decision had been made to make each note a separate muted colour, and this one was brown. Not the most exciting choice to debut the new money, but having such a prosaic colour for what would be the most used note was a good choice. On one side was a design based on the Book of Kells, not an exact extract, but a selection of the Celtic-style Latin text surrounding a drawing of a panther taken from the margins. On the other side was a capital letter A from the Welsh manuscript The Rice March Psalter, and a bold, friendly-looking old man wrapped in a thick robe. This was Johannes Scotus Erigena, or John the Scot, Irish-born, who the historian Bertrand Russell called the most astonishing person of the 9th century. Born in Ireland around 815 AD, he studied in a monastery and moved to France in 845 AD at the invitation of the king. This period is sometimes incorrectly called the Dark Ages, but it was actually an era of philosophy and theology being rediscovered all across Europe. John the Scot was one of the greatest philosophers from Ireland at this time, becoming the head of the Palace School of the Holy Roman Empire. He's a large part of why Ireland became known as the home of saints and scholars. The next note, released in 1977, was the £1 note. This time the colour was green, with accents in red. On one side was an extract from the Book of the Dun Cow, the oldest surviving Irish manuscript. It collects a lot of Irish legends and poems, most about the hero Cuchulainn. On the other side is Cuchulainn's most famous enemy, Queen Maeve of Connacht. Appropriately, the background in this side was an excerpt from the Táin, the story of the war between them. By the way, our logo was inspired by this £1 note. The £10 note, released in 1978, broke the pattern of being based on ancient manuscripts. It had an 18th century map of Dublin on one side and a picture of the 18th century Dublin writer Jonathan Swift on the other. Next to him was the coat of arms used by Dublin City Council back then. The £20 note had another Irish writer, and one we've already mentioned. It was William Butler Yeats who had led the committee to design the first coins. On the other side was a map of the Blasket Islands off the coast of Kerry. The last note was the £50 note, released in 1982. A design for a £100 note featuring the pirate queen Gráinne na Gael was created but never used. The £50 note was a bit different in layout from the others. They used a head and shoulders portrait of their subject. The 50 had the full upper body of Turlough O'Carolan, playing the harp for an audience in the background. An Irish wolfhound stood in front of him. Turlough was an Irish musician from the 18th century who was blinded by smallpox as a teenager. With the support of a patron, he became a travelling harper. Though he was not considered the greatest harp player of the time, his skill in composing tunes and songs became legendary. 200 of these survive, though that's only a fraction of the songs he created during his lifetime. His music was deeply influential, and it's thought that the tune for the American national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, might be based on one of his songs. The Series B notes also heralded a change in the nature of Irish currency. For decades it had been tied to the pound sterling at a 1-to-1 ratio. However, in 1978, Ireland decided to join the European monetary system, which was meant to stabilise the exchange rates between different European currencies. Since the UK did not participate, the Irish punt would now diverge from the pound sterling. Despite this, the connection between the two countries' economies meant that they stayed fairly close, settling into being an average of 1 punt and 10 pence to the pound for most of the next 20 years. 2 new coins came into use during those 20 years. The first was a 20 pence coin, which reused the horse design from the old half-crown. It was about the size of the 10 pence piece, but very different in appearance. It was made from 80% copper and 20% zinc, giving it a golden hue. The second new coin was the pound coin, introduced in 1990. This had a totally new animal, a red deer stag created by the artist Thomas Ryan in the style of the old Percy Metcalfe designs. It had the word punt on it, meaning pound. This led to a joke that it was a medal commemorating the tactics of the Italian 90 Irish football team. The same year, the tuppenny and penny stopped being made in bronze, as it was too expensive. Instead, they were made in copper-plated steel. It became a source of fascination to young children, how the old coins wouldn't stick to magnets, but the new ones would. The last changes to Ireland's currency came in 1992, with the introduction of the Series C banknotes. This was needed because the old banknotes had basically no security features. The theme this time was People Who Shaped the Modern Ireland, with the usual ban on those related to the Civil War. A government committee selected the people who would appear in the notes, and a competition to design them was held. Different artists submitted the design for a £20 note featuring the crusading 19th century politician Daniel O'Connell. It was won by the Dublin artist Robert Balla. In 2020, he spoke to a documentary about some of the challenges he faced in creating the banknotes. For example, the £10 note featured the writer James Joyce, and the bank wanted him to be smiling. However, Balla couldn't find a single photo of Joyce smiling to use for reference. The back of that note had a map of Dublin showing the River Liffey and the matching river god sculpture by Edward Smith. Ironically, the Liffey statue was not one that had been on the Series A banknotes. Next to it was the opening line of Finnegan's Wake, which talks about the river. The £5 note had Sister Catherine Macaulay, founder of the Sisters of Mercy. This was the Catholic order of nuns created in Dublin in 1831 to provide support to poor and homeless women. Putting a nun in the notes was mildly controversial at the time. It became even more controversial later when the abuse and neglect of the Magdalen laundries, which the sisters helped run, came to light. The £50 note was less controversial, despite having a politician on it. That was Douglas Hyde, the first president of Ireland. The back of the note had a drawing of a man playing the uilleann pipes, an Irish traditional instrument similar to the bagpipes. The £100 note had a portrait of one of Ireland's most controversial politicians, Charles Stewart Parnell. Parnell was a rich landowner from Wicklow who became the leader of the Home Rule League, a pressure group agitating for Ireland's political devolution. He managed to reform the League into a political party that won almost all the seats in Ireland, leading them to taking on the role of kingmakers in Westminster. Parnell very nearly managed to get a bill for Home Rule passed in Parliament until a scandal destroyed him. Turned out that he'd been having an affair with a married woman, Kitty O'Shea, for years and was the father of 3 of her children. This revelation destroyed his standing, and without him his party and the Home Rule movement shattered. For many, this tarnished his legacy beyond repair. The era of Irish-designed currency came to an end on the 31st of December 2001 with the introduction of the euro. The idea of a common European currency had been around since the 1960s, and it gradually became more defined through the 90s. The new euro coins allowed each country to have their own design on one side of the coins minted in that country. Ireland paid homage to its old coins through using the same harp image that had been consistent since 1928. Though the Irish coins and notes ceased to be legal tender at the end of February 2002, at least a single one of Percy Metcalfe's classic designs lives on. Thank you for listening to Wild Old Times, a fortnightly podcast about Irish history. Our logo is by Liffey Designs. Check them out at liffeydesigns.co.uk. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. Check out his site at tinwhistler.com. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider giving it a review wherever you find it. It really does help us out. And if you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope you come back for another wild old time from Irish history.